Good morning. The League of Women Voters of Illinois is thrilled to welcome you all to Issues Briefing 2023. Thank you for joining us. Advocacy begins at home. My name is Allison Hout, and it is my honor to serve as the president of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan grassroots organization that believes voters play a critical role in democracy. 6 months before women won the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the League was founded in Chicago at the Congress Hotel. It was February 14th of 1920. Our founders foresaw a need for education for these new voters and to make it possible for them to carry out their responsibilities and to have their voices heard through the power of their vote. Now, here we are today, having just celebrated our 103rd anniversary last week. More effective than ever, focused on empowering all voters and defending democracy. Advocacy begins at home. Here in Illinois, the League is 3,500 members strong, found in 42 local leagues throughout our state, from the southern end in Jackson County, all the way up north to the Wisconsin border, and from the Mississippi River to Lake Michigan. The power of the League is far-reaching because our advocacy is at the grassroots, because advocacy begins at home. Advocacy is not anyone else's responsibility. We cannot hope or assume that someone else will get this job done. Voices being heard, change happening, it begins with each of us. The opportunity is ours to make what we want of it, but it requires that we begin. That is why days like today, why our issues briefing is so very important. Today, our assembly of experts will help each of us acquire information and develop understanding. And we will use what we acquire to discern critical needs, to decide what matters most to us, and to become advocates for change. Advocacy begins at home. With the power of our knowledge and understanding, not only can we choose to engage and advocate, we can also take our learning back into our communities. Within our own communities, we can engage, we can educate, and we can activate others. These engagement opportunities are all around us. I mean, these are simple things. You can share an idea or a fact with a family member during dinner, in a conversation with a neighbor over the fence, with a coworker while you're waiting for a meeting to begin. You can contact your local elected representatives. They are only one email or one phone call away. Have that info at the ready. Put those email addresses and phone numbers in your phone so that you can be heard, so that you can be an advocate. Let your representatives know what is important to you and why. Ask for their support for solutions. Tell your story. Why does this matter to you? Help make sure that your representative represents you by telling them what you think of their actions, what you need, what you suggest. They need to know how many of their constituents agree or disagree with them. Our legislators need our stories to motivate and persuade them. Our representatives know that one of our most important advocacy tools is our vote. Voting sends loud and clear messages about what is important to you. And what we know about civic engagement and education is this: people who have information, people who are engaged, those people are more likely to be voting people. There are many ways that our voices can be heard. I urge you to find some one thing and some way that works for you and to be an advocate. Thank you for being here today to take these steps with us together. Many people have contributed to creating this opportunity for a day of education and activation. Thanks go to the Board of Directors of the League of Women Voters of Illinois, Issues and Advocacy Committee co-chairs Jean Pierce and Rosemary Heilman, our dedicated team of issues specialists, Sarah Kerensky, Communications Committee Chair, and the comms team, and the many local league members who are providing logistics assistance today. And finally, we are deeply grateful to each of our guest speakers for joining us today. Your dedication, expertise, and partnership year-round are a daily inspiration to me and allow all of us to be good allies in our advocacy work. So let's begin. Please listen actively, ask questions, and when the day is over, I encourage you to engage. Please welcome our American Sign Language interpreters for this morning's plenary, Angela Douglas and Donna Stanton. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Jean Pierce to take us into this morning's first session. Thank you, Jean.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. A few meeting reminders. You probably are familiar with these, but at any rate, you will not be able to speak during the two plenaries, the one at the beginning of the day and the one at the end. We are recording the meeting and you will receive the link afterwards. If you have a question during a plenary, please address it only to the people labeled questioner. During the first plenary, I'm the one labeled questioner. During the breakouts, you'll be able to raise your hand electronically and will be called on. But during the plenaries, questions will only come to questioner. Please check out the biographies and resources at the League website. We're pleased to be able to offer professional development credit for teachers this year. You can sign in and out for the whole day for 5 hours of credit, or sign in and out of each session for 1 credit hour each. You can click on the QR code or the link in the chat, which is the same as the one on the screen. I'll leave this on the screen for a few minutes so you can, or well, a few seconds at any rate, so you can get out your phones. And now I'm pleased to introduce you to our first plenary. This session is titled Defending Democracy, Threats to Elections and Voter Access. Our speakers are Gandhi, the Director of Voting Rights for the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. is a senior counsel and works to reduce barriers to voting and improve civic participation, especially in communities of color and low-income communities. Ami's experience includes leading statewide voter protection for general elections, partnering with community members in the criminal legal system to expand voter access, advocating for communities of color during Illinois redistricting, and advising local election authorities as they implement the first Hindi ballots in the country. Clifford Helm is Senior Counsel for Voting Rights and Civic Empowerment at Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. He's a voting counsel and works primarily on the committee's voting rights team. He has worked with community organizations, coalitions, nonprofits, and cooperatives across Chicago on drafting community benefits agreements and developing strategies and policies to support equitable development.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, Jean, for the generous introduction, and Allison as well. And I can tell this is already an energized group, even at this early hour, and really looking forward to digging into this topic with you all. And Cliff and I have several points of information that we would like to share. And we also really look forward to the questions and discussion that we'll reserve time for towards the end of this session. And just want to thank you again for the opportunity to join such an active civic engagement organization in this conversation about confronting the challenges to our democracy. So as Jean mentioned, I'm Ami Gandhi, and Cliff and I, my colleague Cliff and I, will be presenting this session together. As it's often, we're often having this tag team effort for all of the voting rights work that we take on. And we can go ahead to the next slide. We wanted to provide some context at the outset about the lens through which we see voting rights opportunities and challenges. And we're with Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization focused on advancing racial equity. We can go to the next slide. Voting rights is just one area of the work that our organization does. And we are honored to work with colleagues who focus on other areas of civil rights as well, including education equity, equitable community development and housing, and other important practice areas as well. We know that voting rights is not the beginning and the end of the conversation when it comes to advancing racial equity in our Black and Brown communities. And one of the reasons I came to Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights is thinking about strengthening voting rights for the sake of what? You know, what are the other realms in which we can make a positive impact and increase accountability by our government leaders? We can go to the next slide. And one of the reasons we like partnering with other civic organizations is so that we can have a robust shared discussion about what are the most effective ways to advance equity. And we have a community-driven advocacy model. So we know that we're not always going to solely have the best ideas about how to strengthen voting rights. And we really rely strongly on that collaboration with civic organizations, particularly those who focus on and are led by communities of color, in order for us as lawyers, as advocates, to really even attempt to be able to address the very severe threats to our democracy these days. So we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, where I'll set forth for you, and we can go to the next slide to lay out what Cliff and I will talk about today. So I'll first start out with some of the insights from our nonpartisan voter protection work, particularly looking at what we learned in the 2020 election experience. And our voting rights work spans Illinois and Indiana, and we will primarily be focusing on Illinois today. We will also be talking about threats to elections in Illinois, especially as we're in the midst of, it came up very quickly, right? We're in the midst of another election now, and we'll be focusing on important local and municipal elections this spring. And we'll also talk about one of the areas of our legislative advocacy work, which is supporting the movement to re-enfranchise people in prison in Illinois. And last but not least, I know this is a very action-oriented, volunteer-oriented group. I don't think the state of voting rights would be the way that it is in Illinois without all of the efforts from the league. And so we will be talking about ways to volunteer and plug in with our efforts, including right now for the current election cycle. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on, and we can go to the next slide. And this timeline sets forth, I heard Allison, I believe it was a few minutes ago, talk about the, really very recent history of women gaining the right to vote. And certainly that was hard fought. It did not come easily. It didn't come by default by any means. And it's thinking about that event as well as many other relevant events in the history of voting rights and election systems in America and in Illinois that really propels our work and our, small, discrete place in the movement to advance voting rights. We often reflect on the fact that our election system nationally and locally was structured to allow a certain segment to be able to vote and to intentionally exclude others from the electorate and exclude others from being able to elect candidates of their choice and of our choice. And we can go ahead and move to the next slide. There have been so many points along the way, really in very recent history, when additional groups have been permitted to vote. Again, not happening easily or by default, really happening through the sacrifices of Black people, of additional community activists to change the status quo. And it's come with severe backlash as well. Some of the recent events, including Supreme Court decisions, including federal actions and executive administrations with a hostility to voting and to voter access, just show us how hard it is to hang on to any progress in this arena. And the way that we look at it, if we don't confront that past, including that recent past, then it's very hard to have a conversation about our current election system. In particular, because we would want to ideally open up conversations with election officials who do the hard work every election to allow voters the opportunity to have their voices heard, and who also are part of, at least even if they didn't build the systems in the first place, at least maintaining the systems and sometimes perpetuating the systems, even if it might be unintentionally so, that again, were constructed specifically to exclude certain people. And this has a unique impact and an intensified impact on Black voters and voters of color, certainly people in other marginalized communities as well. And if we don't grapple with some of those really foundational aspects of our election system that were built to exclude us, then we won't have the foundation for the most innovative ideas about how to disrupt and improve that system going forward. So we can move on to talking a little bit more specifically and concretely about where modern issues come in. And we know from the work that we do in talking with voters during every election that a lot of people have questions at a pretty granular, practical level. I'm sure many of you see that as well in your different roles being civically engaged, whether it's as a volunteer, a registrar, an election judge, community leader, voter, many other roles that you all play as well. And we hear, and you probably hear also, a lot of questions coming up when people are wondering how and when and where to register to vote. And that space is where many people face challenges in exercising their right to vote. The voting experience and how well that is protected and administered on a practical level plays a big part in whether the right to vote is protected and exercised. And each one of these steps listed towards the bottom of the slide that are part of the voting experience on their own might not be insurmountable, on their own might not be discriminatory. But when we know that there are racial disparities, for example, in people's ability to access voter registration, just as one example, then these barriers in a cumulative way can make the difference between whether someone goes through the effort and sees through the process of voting or whether they end up abandoning it. And we really try to be conscious of that and hopefully trying to add to an environment of comfort around raising questions if anyone has them. We would never want a voter to feel, or someone who might be new to participating in the civic process, to feel that their question is too silly to ask. Because again, the election systems were set up originally to have an exclusionary effect. And so it is not a coincidence that some people may get confused and tripped up by the bureaucracies of the election system. And we're really heartened to have a chance to collaborate with many local election officials, for example, and other government decision makers who want to hear those questions and glitches that are coming up, who want to hear about the barriers voters are experiencing and open up a conversation to try to resolve the problem for eligible voters. And I think that's the exciting thing about especially voting rights work in Illinois, is there are so many opportunities for resolution when the communication is opened up between election officials, voters, and if necessary, people like us, civil rights advocates, other advocates. Sometimes we help bridge any kind of gap that might exist in communication. And then the best thing for us to do might be to get out of the way so that a voter and the people who run the election system can be in touch directly. We can go on to the next slide. I bet that you all are all too familiar with the election protection program, but by way of a little bit of introduction, the National Nonpartisan Election Protection Program is the largest such nonpartisan effort. Probably many of us are involved in it in different ways, whether you realize it or not. Even, for example, simply by sharing our nonpartisan voter protection hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, or the numbers that are available for people who speak languages other than English. We help answer the calls to that hotline, and some of you have been among the people answering the calls, which we really appreciate. And we also help voters in person through nonpartisan poll watching. And we also call them field volunteers. And we sometimes refer to people who pick up the calls to 866-OUR-VOTE as call center volunteers. So I'm saying that because a lot of you have participated in one way or another, and we need and appreciate your continued participation. And when we get a chance to hear those stories from voters firsthand over the phone or in person, that information is really valuable to drive the work that we do and that we want to do more of at a systemic level, to expand voting rights and strengthen voting rights through legislative advocacy, through working with election officials, through community education and partnership, and as well as litigation. We often view litigation as a last resort. It's not an efficient process, and it can be antagonistic by nature. Thankfully, in Illinois voting rights work, there are plentiful opportunities to avoid litigation and try to really look at what is a practical way to solve a problem for a voter. And that's not the case in all other geographic areas. And even Illinois, as I'm sure you all know, being from different parts of the state, Illinois is an extremely varied landscape, and the need for litigation could arise in different parts of the state in different circumstances. Again, when we're really trying to keep an open mind to unintentional barriers that may be unintentional, but may be harmful nonetheless when it comes to access for communities of color. And what we hear from our clients and community partners is that litigation is important to have as an option in order to really try to increase government accountability when it comes to voter access. And we can go ahead to the next slide. We were so fortunate to have a community-wide effort to protect voting rights in the 2022 elections during some times of grave threats to our democracy, and also a lot of fear where we weren't even sure. I'm not sure if any of you felt this way, but oftentimes we, as part of the election protection effort, felt that we're hearing about these threats at the polling place and other interference efforts, and we're not sure how this is going to play out. Is this threat going to be as bad as what's been reported in the media and some of the hype around that? Or is there, what should we do? Should we keep our head down and keep continuing with our kind of typical election protection efforts? Should we open up the lines of communication with election authorities more to see how we can collaborate with them? Because we are ultimately aligned with most election authorities on what their goals are for being able to run a secure election with integrity that allows access to eligible voters. And so we were really proud to be able to help voters through some of those challenging and confusing situations that seemed very unique and intensified in 2022. I don't think that those circumstances are completely over by any means. Part of the reason we're having this discussion is as we're all starting to focus our minds on preparation for 2024 election conditions. And again, through our call center and field programs, election protection staff and volunteers helped voters overcome a variety of different types of challenges. Could be registration questions, could be questions about polling places having changed. So that happened quite a bit with polling place locations changing after redistricting processes and precinct consolidation processes. And so those were a lot of the kinds of questions that were coming up in Illinois, but they were not the only questions coming up from Illinois voters. We were hearing about electioneering and intimidation. Those are issues that we expect could be a bigger proportion even of the questions and concerns that are reported to us during the 2023 municipal elections. In going back to 2022 elections, we also had issues with partial ballots and voting machine errors, improper requests for ID, and lack of accessibility. Now, I am not suggesting that most Illinois voters face these barriers. Many Illinois voters had questions, many had confusion. Again, best case scenario is when that issue can be worked through. This picture, I believe, is from one of our South Suburban community partners where there were issues with lines, long lines, and some confusion about polling place closure time, but I believe some of those issues were overcome in this area. And as I'm thinking back to the 2022 election effort, and which left us all with some scars, I think, because of how intense it was, I wanted to share a few of the memories that came to mind for me. It's a mixed bag. Some of these may be heartening, some of it may be depressing. But again, I'm in the state of mind of let's talk together about this to figure out where to go from here in prepping for the next election. There was an instance, actually multiple instances of voters facing intimidation and even the threat of arrest when trying to correctly insist that a polling place stay open all the way through the time it's supposed to stay open. You're probably familiar with the rule that in Illinois, the polling places close at 7. And if someone is in line by that closing time, which is 7, then the law says they're permitted to be able to vote. But that was not the practical reality for several people who found their way to us. And when they tried to insist on the correct rule and say, no, I and others should be able to vote if we're in line by 7, they faced hostility. And I wonder, we're hearing some more of those stories. I wonder about the additional stress that election judges, or in other words, poll workers, are under these days. So that may be a reality as well that we have to grapple with, and continuing to think about our collective advocacy when those kind of unfair conditions come up, and just think about what could be the most effective way to resolve an issue like that. Because at the end of the day, a voter should not have to deal with that. That's not right. But we do try to think about what could be the most constructive way forward in trying to bring about a change. We also had an instance in the November 2022 election when we successfully advocated to a local election authority to reiterate to all election judges or poll workers the need to supply voters with full ballots after numerous voters contacted us about incomplete ballots in English and other languages. And what especially happened, if you're wondering, why would a ballot have been that long that part of it got left off? When there are long multi-page ballots, it's often because there are many important offices up for election at that time, including elected judges. And for some people, they might zone out when they see the long list of names of judges on the ballot during particular elections. And for other people, judges make a really big difference in their lives and in their families' lives and communities' lives when we're talking about people who are disproportionately impacted by our carceral system, by our court system, and all of the increased civic education that's also happening around judicial elections and candidates. And I say this as a nonpartisan organization, but when voters are making a choice, they have opinions, and a lot of people have done their homework and are hungry for more knowledge. And so a page of a ballot getting left off really makes a difference and is one type of threat to our democracy. Many voters with disabilities faced undue barriers to participation, such as advertised accessibility options that were non-functional. And a lot of people who call us at 866-OUR-VOTE may not even use the word disability. And of course, there are other experts in this field as well. We're not the only ones. We may not even be the main ones who get calls from people with disabilities or health issues that is ending up being involved with their voting process. But even in our limited experience getting those kind of calls, sometimes people talk about, an age-related condition that they're facing, or life experience that they're facing, or a health issue, or it might be someone calling in because the reason that they are bogged down with the access to voting barrier is because they're trying to help a friend or family member, elderly or otherwise, to be able to exercise their right to vote. So the main door of a polling place that was supposed to be accessible being locked, and people having to go into an alley to still be able to get into the voting room, but having to find some other way, may not be a big deal for some voters, and may be unfair or illegal for other voters to have to deal with. And some issues that were barriers to access in 2022 elections in Illinois were most closely monitored and addressed by other specialized groups. I think one of the really special things about the Illinois voting rights landscape is that there are many different people fighting for voting rights. It's clearly not just our organizations. Just one example is Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago has had a very specialized, robust effort to enforce language access to the polls for a variety of geographic areas and variety of language groups. And I'm going to wrap up my section before turning it over to Cliff with this one, with the next slide, which is about one of the areas that we have under the purview of our election protection work, which is jail voter protection, or in other words, voter protection in the context of eligible voters in pretrial detention, people who are awaiting trial and who are going through the procedural process for their case, who have not been convicted, and who are primarily in the situation of being in pretrial detention because of financial inability to pay bail. Some of that landscape could change in the days ahead in Illinois, but the reality is it has not changed yet. And there are the majority of people in pretrial detention, vast majority, are eligible to vote technically and have been under the laws of the state and the country for a long time, but in a practical sense are often unable or find it very difficult to go through all of the procedural hoops to be able to exercise that right to vote. There's been a lot of progress in this arena in Illinois, thanks to the hard work of many civic organizations, certainly not just us, also League of Women Voters of Chicago, Chicago Votes, Rainbow Push has been at this for years. There are some regional specific organizations who have been advancing the conditions in this field, including Speak Up and Vote, who's active and who's shown leadership in improving jail voter access in Will County. And I know that League of Women Voters of Central Kane County has played a really important role as well, relating to some of the conditions, not just about the elections themselves, but all of the hard work it takes to engage people even before the elections, for example, through voter registration. So there's a lot of work that we feel fortunate to be able to do to protect the voting rights of people in pretrial detention, also people who have a past criminal record. And there's just a very robust effort underway in Illinois with an important leadership role played by people most directly impacted by our carceral system, incarcerated and returning community members who insist that we need to have stronger voting rights in Illinois. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Cliff to talk more about our next section. And Cliff, please take the time that you need for this section, and then I'll pick back up a little bit later on in our presentation.
Great, thank you. So hi, everybody. My name is Cliff. I'm a senior counsel with the Chicago Lawyers Committee. Right now, I work predominantly in the voting rights practice area. With the organization, I've also worked more in the equitable community development area. And the overlaps of those are pretty interesting, particularly when you talk about the boundaries of who gets to vote on what. So redistricting maps, investment into communities, and how that impacts their representation at the government level. So we try to bring across ideas from the entirety of our organization to work on specific issues that are playing out within our practice areas as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of generalized threats to elections, or just the sort of voting rights as they exist in Illinois, and maybe what they are looking at and what we can be concerned about and keeping an eye on. So we can go to the next slide and get started on that. So just as a little bit of sort of context nationwide about what we mean by voting rights and voter access, just being aware that across the country there are disagreements about what election access, what voter access is, and how far it should go, and how much we should be going in one direction or the other. All of these conversations, I think it's important to understand, sort of to put ourselves in a historical context of looking at what voting rights as a concept is, that it and where it comes from and who protects it. This is actually a more recent idea than we sometimes give credit to, although this group, as Allison mentioned at the beginning, does talk and focuses on when the advent of the idea of voting rights for everybody came around, including both race-based restrictions and gender-based restrictions that have been removed. Voting rights is technically a federally protected right, and it's very broadly defined there. But unfortunately, not unfortunately, but as the details of what the right to vote is, and what that right encompasses, is set by local state laws and their approaches to both the policies that they create and the practices that they run. So voting rights from one state to another often looks very different, and not necessarily in disagreement with what the federal law says, but disagreement amongst themselves, which is why we get things like this question of what voter ID we need from one state to the next, and why Indiana and Illinois are so different, why every state has its own perspective on that, even though one state might be saying these types of voter ID laws that impacts and reduces the, not just reduces, but creates a barrier to the right to vote, and other states are instead saying, no, it does not. There are some sort of more minor things, not minor, sort of more practice-based things related to polling place locations and access, which I think, you actually touched on as well, and how those play out in terms of what the local jurisdictions are doing, what the local authorities and what the state authorities are doing. But even those questions, I think it's important to understand the racial disparities and the history of racialization within the context of voting rights, which Ami also mentioned and walked through a little bit. And then on top of that, the history of even racialized violence as it goes to some of these issues. So polling place access today might be something that the state or the local jurisdiction really controls and works and sets. But it historically there have been private actors that have used violence, that have used other tools and tactics to actually impact how and where and when people vote. With this historical framework, there continue to be these modern disparities in voter access, and we continue to see laws that do similar things that historically have happened in maybe a different way that we've now no longer allow, but we still see as they are maybe intending to set laws based on potentially even an agenda to what those laws might be. And it happens in sort of all across the country in every state. And we'll get into more of the practice of the law here, but maybe not so much the motivation today. But we do still know that those agendas often exist. So a few examples are on the slide. And one other piece that is often relevant to this conversation, which I would like to dig into more, but won't be happening today, and is just a personal interest of mine, is sort of what is the meaningful choice on a ballot that is presented to somebody, and how does that impact the idea of the right to vote? So things like redistricting, maybe access to being on the ballot, campaign finance, impact that question as well. So with that context, we can go on to the next slide, get into some specifics. Illinois as a state is a little bit of a mixed bag, so to speak. You can see that there are numbers of examples of top line on this top line that are really voter friendly, really this opening up this idea of voter access and showing that there's an investment into ensuring that people have the right to vote and to do so freely and fairly. But on the bottom line, there are some examples in Illinois still that are persistent that are not necessarily things that open up this idea of voter access, and that there are still examples where the way that we go about doing something in the state, in Illinois, it restricts people's ability to vote. So on the top, just a few positive examples. We have very recently included permanent vote by mail, so somebody can sign up to always get a vote by mail ballot in Illinois. Ami mentioned the polling places in jails and temporary polling places there. Illinois' version of grace period registration, which is kind of a unique term to Illinois, we sort of invented that, is the idea that there's not really a time limit on when you can register to vote, where there might be technically 28 days, 30 days deadlines, various deadlines around how you can register to vote based on different mechanics. But nonetheless, if you've lived in Illinois for 30 days, you can show up to your polling place and vote, even if you haven't registered yet. And that is a very voter access friendly piece of law and practice. And it is something that is generally thought about as an example around the country. We also have a friendly ID law, so voter friendly. So this idea that we do need to prove who we are in order to vote, but we can be doing so in a way that is both secure and that we know who everybody is when they're voting, but understands the motivations and why people vote, and doesn't add any burdens on top of that might either be burdensome very generally or very specifically to a specific group or population of people. And other states do not necessarily take this perspective. And we'll kind of get into a little bit the motivations around that later. So on the bottom line, there are some very broad concerns. Some of these are across the country as well. So language access concerns on the ballot itself, at the polling place, accessing the polling place and understanding. That's a concern that plays out locally, and is a concern that is still nationally something that we collectively have yet to address in a encompassing and very meaningful way that creates voter access. We also, in Illinois, we still do not allow people in prison to vote. So if somebody's convicted of a felony, then they would, once they are incarcerated, they lose the right to vote. This is an issue that we'll talk a little bit more about, but it is one that it really hits on something that is an issue across the country related to mass incarceration and the disparities of who is impacted by mass incarceration. We'll come back to that. And then, as mentioned before, polling place closures, changes, what happens at the polling place. Illinois has a history of maybe not doing everything it can when we get to a polling place and see the things happening there. From, if any of you remember all of this from voting, from Sharpies, the Sharpie gate, so they said, just how ballots and or handled at the polling place and some of the issues that were present there, but also more systemically in the last election cycle in 2022, there were a significant number of polling place changes across the entire time. And there were a number of reasons for this related to both the redistricting process. So we had new Chicago ward maps that were passed, and then a state level change that changed the number of people that were supposed to be in a precinct, making them bigger. As a result of this, they had to remap everything between the primary and the general election. And more than half the people in Chicago had their polling place changed, not necessarily because any one actor had the discretion to do that, but because there was this mandated state law around it, and there was some problems with the rollout in terms of when that redistricting process happened. And then overall, I think we also see, and we've experienced, and probably many of you on this call experience, the power dynamics that are present in the state legislatures and every sort of elected official when they are relating with what decisions to make as it relates to how they themselves get elected, or how a party that they are part of maybe sees voting, sees what people, how they can use the process, or how they should be stewards of the process around things like redistricting, and what happens when they go through that process. The frustration with the redistricting process specifically, where they redrew the lines for the state level representative districts and the Senate districts, really played out in the sense that the community voices really felt like they were not included, and they were never intended to be included. And that process created a power dynamic that said the people that are elected, that are in charge of this process, are going to do one thing, and they know what they're going to do, and they have their sort of outcome envisioned already, and that community voices were not upfront included into that process itself. And then, so that's sort of a picture of sort of where we are in Illinois. There's lots more, of course. These are just a few examples, but then we can zoom out a little bit, and we can go to the next slide. One of the things that whenever we talk about this idea of election protection, when we talk about attacks on democracy or attacks on election, that the big topics today are what myths and narratives exist, challenging the validity of elections, challenging the validity of votes, and creating narratives that say elections aren't as strong or aren't as protected as they maybe haven't been in the past, or some sort of other myth around voter fraud more generally. These myths, these narratives, some of the misinformation and disinformation around it expands to encompass really a wide range of theories, and then they use actions related to those, targeting sort of every level of our elections process, using things from sort of the public statements all the way to specifically including litigation, and targeting and using the court system to try to address and attack some of the elections that we, that we're participating in. And there's an underlying theory around all of this that is not always clear, but there is very much a push that uses these theories for harmful changes to law and practices that potentially can reduce voter access. And they all tend to lay this groundwork for challenging elections at every local level. So we can go a little bit more specifically on the next slide. And so some of the things that they use and they challenge, and some of the processes that result in these myths gaining a lot of momentum, is challenging things like third-party registration drives, which I believe League of Women Voters actually may really engage in a lot of these things, with something like going to a college campus or an event and trying to get people to register to vote. they use there are some of the challenge perspectives on voter fraud suggest that this is just voter fraud, that there is something about this that's happening that is there, but they don't provide any context, reasons, or potentially underlying evidence to show that. And so they use things like that to really push for different aspects. And we can go to the next slide, a little quicker. And so examples of this locally that we've seen, if you follow any of the school-based and libraries conversations that are involving a lot of other topics, there's groups like Awake Illinois that not only use their tactics focusing on what's happening at a particular event or maybe a school's curriculum, but they're also looking at the elections and the school board elections in particular, and challenging within the context of that in order to push a specific agenda that they're trying to work through. We've also seen groups use discredited data techniques. So there's a lot of this focus on looking at voter rolls in particular and using some comparison levels to say that these people aren't allowed to vote as a way to prove that there's some sort of voter fraud that they can show up for. And they do not actually have a basis for this. This technique is pretty discredited and it's pretty obvious why, but they don't necessarily care. What they end up potentially doing is looking at trying to get voter rolls published and looking at the voter rolls that they got versus maybe who voted, or maybe comparing it across states, and trying to show a one-to-one comparison that one person's on a voter roll that shouldn't be there. And then they say that they found thousands of people that are on the voter rolls that voted, that is evidence of voter fraud. But there are many reasons why that would not be the case. And this has been continuously discredited. What they tend to do right now, and what we've also seen with some groups like Judicial Watch, which is mentioned here during the litigation, of challenging some of the privacy elements related to voter rolls and saying that there is a right that they have to see the entire voter roll so that they could publish it online, which obviously has some other consequences to it beyond them just comparing those voter rolls, but also putting individual people at risk when they try to do that. And that seems to be part of the intention of it, going back to this idea of threats, going back to the idea of, who is a target and what does it mean when they try to say that they should not be voting. And then the last thing that we've seen to highlight here is upcoming in some of the elections for next year, 2024 in particular. We are aware that there may be some very agenda-based poll watching that is being pushed both by partisan groups, but also by groups with a very specific agenda around who should be voting and why they should be voting and who they should be voting for. So it's a little bit different to me than what a partisan agenda is, and instead there's a challenge to the fundamental nature of what voting is and who gets to vote. Operation Eagle Wings is, it's a name, I guess. But it's one of these national organizations that works with groups. They're also, like, another group is called the America Project, and they are looking to formalize their way that they are getting involved in elections and using poll watchers to push a certain agenda. And that might be doing something like using the voter challenge procedure in order to put more barriers in front of people that, based on their perspective, shouldn't be voting. And we know that that's either oftentimes an explicit or an implicit bias that they might have towards who they think should vote or who they think has the ability to vote. And then we can go to the next slide. And some of these we've mentioned a little bit already. There are some very specific concerns we're worried about in this election coming up with some of the polling place moving issues that we both just highlighted. There are still concerns that people are going to show up at polling places, particularly in Chicago, and be told that this is not their polling place and that they have to go find another one. This impacts people without cars and without transportation, and community areas that are disinvested, and particularly those without significant access to public transportation. much more significantly than other areas, and the disproportionate outcomes are apparent there. There's also this upcoming election in Chicago, the ECPS election, which is essentially a board, elected board that will have some oversight over the police department. And there's some concerns about who is going to be favoring which candidates and how electioneering is going to be playing into that. All this exists. We're also interested in knowing what other questions, what other concerns there are about the municipal elections. So if you could work that into a question, that would be amazing for us. And then we can take that and help assess our election production plan for the upcoming elections. And I think I'm getting towards the end of my time, or maybe past it. So I mean, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Sure. Well, before you completely pass it to me, Cliff, I have 2 questions for you. So this is in reaction to your really insightful presentation. So one is, can you please lay out for folks as they're starting to think about their questions and input for us, the different elections that are coming up? Because I know you mentioned some city of Chicago specific elections. And so I guess, can you say a little bit more about your question in terms of the types of elections that are coming up?
Sure. So there are 2 elections in Illinois coming up very soon. There is on February 28th, there is much of the state will be doing primary elections for their municipal governments, and people that are on the local ballot from the municipal level down for the most part will be having primaries. And this won't be in every county. It won't be in every municipality. It will only be where they sort of choose to do so and where there are people running in a primary. Slightly differently, Chicago is also having an election on February 28th, but it is a general election in the sense that if somebody wins that election, they could be elected that day. And there are no primaries, there are no partisan primaries related to Chicago on that day. And there's a strange historical reason for this, which is the creation of the runoff system rather than having a primary. So in Chicago, if somebody wins 50% of the vote on February 28th, they will be elected. If they do not, then they will go to a runoff with the second highest vote getting candidate. And then there will be general elections everywhere following that up on April 4th. And so across the state, there will be a larger set of elections where people will be elected for municipalities across the state. And then in 2024, we have the presidential cycle again. So there will be federal elections along with state and county level elections and some other things. And those will happen both a primary earlier in the year in March and then the general election in November.
Thank you. My other question for you before I discuss this topic of voter access and voting in prison. My other question for you is what would you say to someone who asked, well, Chicago Lawyers Committee, you all do nonpartisan poll watching. Do you have an agenda? What's your agenda? Given that you talked about agenda-based poll watching, and there is a lot of concern about that these days for good reason. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think we do have an agenda. I think I sometimes forget that this is an agenda, the broadest definition of the word. But our goal is to make sure that everybody who is eligible to vote is able to vote freely and fairly. And so when I say agenda, I mean people potentially with a political agenda that would like to use this to influence the outcome of the election itself. And we do not have a political agenda. As a nonpartisan organization, we really have to maintain that and know and believe in the value of that. So when I reference agendas for other people, I think it is more specifically about them identifying either restriction on who they think should be voting or potentially using that as a way to influence the outcome of the election in a very particular way.
Thank you. I am going to spend a brief couple minutes talking about an example of the legislative advocacy that we are involved with. And one of the outgrowths of our election day work, when we try to think about, in partnership with voters who are most directly impacted by disenfranchisement, what are the more systemic types of ways to expand voter access, to make voter access more just, beyond just the nitty-gritty problem solving that can be accomplished on election day. And one of those ways we have found has been to take a hard look and question our presumptions as Chicago Lawyers Committee and as civil rights attorneys on voter eligibility in the first place. So we can move to the next slide. Chicago Lawyers Committee is really proud to provide legal counsel to Chicago Votes and their Unlock Civics Coalition on a legislative initiative in Illinois called Voting in Prison. So this is one of the priority areas for Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And this bill has been considered in the Illinois legislature for the last couple of years and has gotten more support than ever before, but still not enough support to be passed into law yet. And the impetus for this has really come from our work with incarcerated and returning community members and the long-term scholarship and policy formulation and advocacy that they have been involved in and leading up to point out that, and I want to say too, our partnership with Dr. Christina Rivers of DePaul University has been instrumental in our journey as well in deciding ultimately to adopt this policy position and to fight for it and to be legal support for people who are leading the advocacy. And reflecting on the fact that historically, there has not been a meaningful policy justification for not allowing people to vote in prison. And Illinois is not alone. Actually, the vast majority of states disenfranchise people when they are serving a sentence following a conviction. And yet voting is one of the most meaningful ways that a person has to participate in society. And so this is why we do what we do. And, you know, I have to say a few years ago, I've been at Chicago Lawyers Committee for about 7 years. And a few years ago, when we were thinking about taking on some early stage legal analysis relating to this position, this idea that some of the civic organizations that we work with, including a think tank in Stateville Prison, believe in re-enfranchisement of people in prison. And I wondered, what is Chicago Lawyers Committee's position going to be on that type of policy? What would our leadership of our organization say or think in reaction to the voting rights team thinking about spending our work time on this? And so that has been, I think, a positive journey for our legal organization. And I hope ultimately a journey that others are willing to join as well, including in the legal community, where there is not a whole lot of discussion about voter eligibility. And I think there can be more to take a look at, was it sound in the first place to disenfranchise people in prison? And if we conclude not, then what can we do to try to correct the conditions around voter eligibility? And what can we do collectively? Because it will take a collective effort to change the status quo. And we certainly can continue the conversation about that specific policy. If anyone's interested in getting more involved or even in learning more, even if someone is in a learning stage and just wants to explore the issue a bit more. On a personal note, one of the reasons that this matters to me is because several of my loved ones are not eligible to vote for different reasons relating to immigration status or status in the carceral system. And I don't take for granted my right to vote. And I know that none of us here do. And that is the representation of the kind of work that we feel privileged to get to do on the systemic level. I'm sure many people are wondering how they may be able to get more involved. And so I'm going to turn it back to Cliff, and then we will open it up for questions.
Thank you. We can go, to the next slide even. So with election protection, there are a few ways to volunteer. For these elections right now, for February 28th and April 4th, we are mostly focusing our efforts on nonpartisan poll watching, which you do have to be a registered Illinois voter to do. You can get more information on our website. I think I can put this in the chat too. Where there is a sign up form. We are about to close signups for February 28th, and then shortly after that, we will open them back up for April 4th. If you are interested in being a poll watcher, there's a training that we have to ask everybody to do and participate in. And then we would greatly appreciate any volunteers that are able to join for that. It's a huge effort, and we rely on those volunteers that do all of the on-the-ground work on election day. So we'd appreciate any help. And check out our website if you're interested in that. And I think that's the end of our prepared stuff, I believe.
Okay, thank you very much, Ami and Cliff. We'll share some questions that have been submitted. You mentioned this. Is there more to say? What can I do if I want to help the Chicago Lawyers Committee on Election Protection?
I think best thing to do is to go to that website and either hit the sign up button. You can also email us. I think there should be a generic email there or an email for another person, Kiana, to get on our specific listserv around voting rights. So if you don't want to sign up exactly right now, you can always get on that email list to get more information as we share it out.
Great. How can we get involved in ending disenfranchisement? Do you have recommendations?
I'll start by answering about disenfranchisement of people in prison, and maybe I'll turn it to you, Cliff, if you would like to add to that answer in any way. But I had mentioned that the organization Chicago Votes leads the Unlock Civics Coalition, and it's a wonderful space. And we all are probably involved in many different coalitions. I do think that the way that it is community-led and inclusive and a warm place for fellow advocates to come together and fight for change, I really enjoy it. I think others here may enjoy it as well. And so it's something to consider if a person or organization may want to find out where they may fit in. And I'm not calling the shots on where everyone fits in, but Chicago Votes and their Unlock Civics Coalition is a good place for people who would want to support the re-enfranchisement movement for people in prison in Illinois. And I'll turn it to Cliff maybe to provide other ideas about how to get involved.
Yeah, I think that in terms of felony disenfranchisement, that's the place that we really encourage people to support. There's obviously other types of disenfranchisement that might be happening sort of more through like practices or through barriers that are created for people, and election protection is a good way to get involved in that. I would also suggest that if you do have experience working in a jail setting or anything like that, you can feel free to reach out to us and we can figure out a way to incorporate that experience and to work with you to help out with that way.
So I think you already answered this, but someone said, do you have enough volunteers? Do you need more? I think you can always use more volunteers, right? And the numbers that you gave, that includes volunteer people who were helping in Indiana as well as Illinois, correct?
The volunteer numbers?
Yes.
Yes. So no, yes, I think is the answer. So we don't have enough volunteers. We would love more volunteers. As Cliff mentioned, the volunteer form, which he shared for the February 28th election, will close in a few days. We would love more volunteers for February 28th. And we also will be, again, recruiting volunteers for April 4th, particularly in suburban areas. And so please get involved with us if you would like to volunteer on either or both of those dates, February 28th and or April 4th. And we also have voter protection efforts in Indiana during elections. Some of the numbers were very specific to Illinois. However, the majority of our pro bono volunteers are in communities in Illinois. And then the primary dates are different for the states. So those end up being very focused on just one state at a time, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Do you think that Dominion's 1.6 billion defamation suit is going to lessen some of the false narratives we've been hearing?
Cliff, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so that's something that when we hear about information like that and we try to engage in it, we really rely on some of our national partners. So there's a National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. There's also groups like the Brennan Center, who have a picture of this from that perspective. My short answer is I hope so. If that, I don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. And it is one of those things where I kind of mentioned this difference between an individual taking action and doing something and pushing a narrative versus the state or the federal government doing something, and both of them have significant harms potentials on individuals' voting rights, access, voter suppression, all those different things. So I don't know what is going to happen with that lawsuit. It is a mind-bogglingly big number. So I do hope that there is some impact on it. Private actors have just as much, and in this case, it's a media company. They have just as much impact. And sometimes, historically, we've seen even more impact on people's rights to vote, and the overlap of, what elected official, what public official is encouraging them, whether that's explicitly, implicitly, or they think it's implied. And we've seen that before, and this is a modern version of it. In the past, it's looked like violence at the polls to try to stop people from voting, but they maybe felt like that they were told to do so or felt empowered to do so. And this plays into that. So hopefully that things like this can help address it, we hope. But do you have any other thoughts on that?
I want to add to Cliff's helpful insights that in addition to national insights and studies that are very important, also the hyper-local insights on how to tackle conversations and hype about the myth of widespread voter fraud. Those local insights are very meaningful too. I remember, Jean, I think when we first met, I got a little bit of a flavor, and you would have a better idea of conversations local to your area about how do people grapple with conversations about, is voter fraud real? What is the data around it? And there was it seemed like an appetite to talk through that. I don't know that I think we're all shared in the point of view that we don't want to uplift harmful and untrue myths. At the same time, if we totally ignore it and don't kind of work toward debunking it, then we may be letting a problem fester. And so I frequently will call upon local leaders to say, what do you think about how to navigate this conversation when unfortunately it's coming up in a bunch of different places? And as recently as this week, and at least one of the jurisdictions we work in, we're hearing government leaders say things like, now I know that there's not widespread voter fraud. We all agree on that, but we should do what we can to go after and prevent and criminalize any tiny bit of voter fraud, because I heard from someone who heard from someone who heard from someone else that there was some voter fraud that happened that wasn't addressed effectively. And like doing a lot of fear mongering too, through some of these stories, and singling out particular communities, including communities of color. And so I think some of the myths will evolve over time. And I hope that some of them get effectively debunked, and then there could be other new ones or adapted versions of ones that come up that together we will need to address.
This is a new one to me, but I'll bet you've heard it before. Is it appropriate for an election authority to have signs at polling places that say, showing an ID will make your time go more quickly?
if anybody's actually seen that, we would appreciate a picture of it and sharing it with us. So in general, context is everything, right? I mean, I'm not sure if there's a specific rule against this, but and maybe you could supplement that if so, but we do know that, so some authorities like Cook County, suburban Cook County, for instance, they use this system where if you have a driver's license, you can give it to them and then they will expedite your registration process. What they can't imply is that you would need to show an ID during the process. And so there has been some conflict there. We've seen some conversations around what it feels like election judges saying you have to show an ID. And we get calls about that actually from across the state every election. And there is some confusion that maybe is being given to local election judges in their training about what this dynamic is. It is a very complicated dynamic. If on the one hand, the election authority is saying, well, IDs can help us expedite the process because we can just scan them and then it'll pull up all the information. There won't be an issue with it. But on the other hand, an election judge in a training might hear that and say, oh, everybody has to show an ID. And so that is really problematic. And a sign like that maybe pushes that perspective that somebody walking in there might think they need to show an ID, even if it doesn't say exactly that. And so we would want to know context for that every time. And that's exactly an example of something that we would hope somebody would call the 866-OUR-VOTE number for to talk through.
Do you have any idea how many people went to the wrong polling places this past November? And if you don't have those data, is there any way of tracking that?
We know that there were a number of people that did that. We don't know if there is a way to track it. They likely are not. When they showed up, the election authority would not have sort of tracked that as like searching for somebody that was not at their, and then found out that they were not on the rolls at that particular polling place. That would not have been logged. We have some information about it, but we also know that lots of people didn't call us when they faced that issue. And there's a good article talking about a particular neighborhood in Chicago from in North Lawndale that goes into this a little bit and some of the other things that were happening there. The thing that maybe we could track is the use of provisional ballots, which would have been an incorrect use of a provisional ballot, which is a ballot that does not get counted unless certain things are met after the election. So somebody might have been incorrectly informed that they showed up at the wrong polling place and they should cast a provisional ballot. So there's a possibility we could see how many of those were cast, but it's not something that we know that we can get an exact number on. But we think it was a good number of people. And from our perspective, you know, 1 person, 5 people, 100 people, you know, they are different, but it's not, it's the same issue regardless of how many people it happened.
Do you know if there's a plan to educate voters not to destroy their mail ballot if they change their mind and want to vote in person? People need to know that a mail ballot is an official document issued to their name and address.
Sure, I can share a little bit about that. I think we would be interested in knowing if there is a need for that kind of education locally or otherwise. People who do initially request to vote by mail and then it could be for a number of different reasons, decide to or want to vote in person, have a few different options available to them. And the person who asked the question, as they probably well know, if someone asked me, I would recommend, if they asked me before they had done anything like that, I would recommend for them to bring that ballot in order to vote in person and to surrender that. But we do sometimes talk to people who have destroyed it or who have lost it or who never received it. There still are some postal service delays, and there are still legal options available for people to still be able to have the right to vote, even if they had requested a vote by mail ballot and then something changed and they needed to or wanted to vote in person. So we would, again, ask people to call us at 866-OUR-VOTE. It can be situation dependent, and we want people to be comfortable to call us. no matter what the kind of factual nuance of their question might be. I do also want to mention, if I may, because I got a message helpfully suggesting that I provide clarification about something. So I know we have been talking pretty quickly in today's brief presentation about different categories of people in the carceral system. So I want to make it clear where Illinois is at with regard to voter eligibility. So people in pretrial detention are eligible to vote, though they may, and they do face practical barriers to exercising that right. Upon conviction, while serving a sentence, for example, in an Illinois prison, people are disenfranchised, they are removed from the rolls, they are not eligible to register or vote. And that is the piece of the process that I talked about when I talked about the movement to re-enfranchise people in prison. Also in Illinois, under the current law, people are eligible to get back on voter rolls after a release from Illinois prison. So that eligibility is automatically restored when someone leaves prison, but they have to take the proactive step to register in order to be able to vote again. And there is a lot of prevalent misinformation out there by government officials, by corrections officers, by community members with a misunderstanding. And so some people, unfortunately, think that they are banned for life from voting if they had a past criminal record. And that's not the case in Illinois. And so we appreciate that there already has been some progress in Illinois when it comes to voting rights of people in the carceral system. And there's also more work to do.
So what happens if someone is challenged at a voting place by a member of Eagle Watch or another group? Are there any consequences if the challenge is identified as false or perhaps malicious?
We would hope so, but it's not extremely clear what would happen. I think that if what our approach would be, first in the challenge itself. So what happens when somebody's challenged, that means somebody else there is challenging their identity or whether or not they're a registered voter or eligible to vote in the place where they're at. To fix that, they can show ID is usually the solution. That if what happened with the challenge is deemed to be good enough, so to speak, that they then have to prove it. And so if somebody has ID, an election judge might be like, oh no, this is the person. But nonetheless, that creates both a confrontational setup and a barrier in both this is a heightened emotional environment now, and then it's also creating a situation where you have to show something that you might not have. So if somebody is there doing challenges in a way that is malicious, I would hope there would be consequences, but we would likely be first working with the election authority to diffuse the situation and trying to work through what the process would be with whatever the local election authority is, whether that's the county clerk or a city board of elections, to highlight the issue and point it out and to show that there is somebody potentially doing this and to work through it that way. And if that doesn't, and this is a normal way that we work through a lot of issues, is that because everything is so local in Illinois, we have a very decentralized system, that a lot of the practices and policies really run through those local election authorities. And that's usually the first step to address many of these issues, which we find to be a lot more effective, even than particularly than involving law enforcement, and also potentially more effective than involving state level agencies. So working at that level first to be potentially helping to resolve that situation. And then later, if we do hear about this, we would formulate a strategy at that point to help to bring about what we could do to change it so it doesn't happen for the following election.
Is there any number or estimate for the actual number of fraud cases in voting in Illinois? Any way of getting a handle on that?
I can give an answer to that. It's data from a few years ago. Would be thrilled to welcome updated data on that if the state of Illinois can do that. In 2017, the Illinois State Board of Elections published data that the incidence of, let me say this again. In 2017, the Illinois State Board of Elections said that a couple thousandths of 1% of ballots cast in Illinois involved instances of suspected voter fraud. That is based, again, on the data published by the bipartisan Illinois State Board of Elections. They have 4 appointees from each of the major political parties. And they published that data in response to the then Trump presidential administration issuing requests for information to all of the local authorities around the country, overbroad requests for information. And Illinois State Board of Elections replied and complied with that request for information. And this was part of what they shared and made publicly available. I appreciate them. In the kind of work we do, we are sometimes advocating to and against election authorities. That's the nature of the work we do with standing up for voters. I also can say I appreciate the work that they do and respect it. And Illinois State Board of Elections, that data came up again when there was a loss. It's probably come up again numerous times to set the record straight. And one of those times was when there was a lawsuit during the 2020 election cycle trying to disrupt and take down Illinois' vote by mail system. And again, the state of Illinois defended the vote by mail system and said that it is a secure system. It has worked well for Illinois voters from all political backgrounds and is not it should not be an excuse to perpetuate myths of widespread voter fraud.
I have a hard time translating percentages. My understanding of 1,000th of 1% is that it's 1 per 100,000 ish, and maybe worse than that. But either way, I also would clarify, Ami, that when they said instances of that, I think that encompasses a wide variety of things that maybe.
Yeah, that was suspected. It didn't all even make its way to a conviction or anything remotely like that. And so we, in Chicago and Illinois voting, it would be important to hear someone out if they have a concern or a question about voter fraud or voter intimidation. I would say just these broader categories of uncomfortable conditions and contexts that can happen with regard to voting, because there is a dark history of unfair elections in Illinois and in Chicago. And also, we need to take a hard look at the facts now. And so I appreciate the question about the data and Cliff's clarification too.
So thank you both for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you to our league members and friends of the league for joining us. If you'd like more information, please look at the resources